Hey dear chess friend, I'm International Master Ostrovskiy and this course is dedicated to the art of defense. If you look at the stats of professional players, you may notice that they don't tend to lose a lot of games. Is it because they get better positions and win? Well, not necessarily. If you pay a closer look to their games, you may discover that they score a lot from worse positions, which means that being good at defending is no less important than being good at converting the advantage. The position that you can see on the board right now is taken from one of my own games, and I decided to share it with you in this intro lesson just to make you better sense what this course is all about. Let's get started. This game was played with a time control of 90 minutes for 40 moves, plus 30 minutes after move 40, plus incremental 30 seconds for each move starting from the very first one. And this position arose after 40 moves exactly. Earlier in the game, I had better chances. At some point, I even had the advantage, but I somehow managed to spoil everything in a time scramble around move 40. So as you may notice here, I am a pawn down, and my pieces occupy not the best squares, so I was definitely not very happy with the result. At the same time, I was feeling like having a break, so I decided to leave the playing venue for some minutes, just to enjoy a cigarette, a cup of coffee, trying to reset my brain, and to prepare myself for fighting in this new situation. You may be wondering why I'm even telling you all this non-chess related bullshit. Well, because I don't think it is bullshit. All these small things actually add to the psychological background at the specific stage of the game, and later you will understand how much this matters. During my break, I didn't think about the specific continuations, I didn't try to calculate the things, so I was trying to evaluate this new situation in very general terms. So what I understood is that I'm no longer number one, so most likely I have to fight for a draw, and I was trying to accept this new reality. I came back to the table just to see my opponent still thinking, and I started thinking as well. In a few minutes, he played the strongest move in this position, which basically only added to my general evaluation of the position, so I am definitely worse here. So what he played was the move g5. Very strong continuation, not wasting the time, just starting the attack, trying to exploit the bad position of black's king and this very specific and very bad coordination of black's pieces. So the main idea behind g5 is obviously to make g4 square available for the knight, and now white is going to add this knight to the attack quickly, just attacking h6 square, f6 square, and in many cases it will create a threat of a fork. Also having in mind that dark squares around my king are so weak, and f6 will be most likely exchanged or will go away somewhere. Well, the bishop that is at the moment on c1 will just make this move to b2 and will make white's attack almost decisive. That was the whole point of g5. It was really annoying since it was a tempo move, so I didn't have a lot of possibilities here. I just started calculating some variations here, just realizing that, well, my position really sucks. The very first thing I quickly realized is that if I take the pawn on g5, then after f takes g5, queen somewhere, doesn't really matter where. The knight goes to g4, and I don't have a satisfactory defense against two threats. So the one is knight to f6, simply winning the exchange. Another one is basically knight to h6, followed by bishop b2, and this may well lead to a checkmate. So after g5, I had to make a move. I realized that I had nothing better than just playing on, making, the best moves, trying to show the defense, trying to make the task of my opponent as hard as possible. So I play queen to h5 here, just targeting the rook on d1, and already here I had in mind an interesting tactical trick that I performed a bit later. So the first point here is that if my opponent takes the pawn on f6, then I just play king to f7, and it's already lost for white. Surprisingly, white's king becomes much worse than black's one here, and I add my rook to the attack here. As you may notice, my bishop c5 controls this very important diagonal, limiting the king as well, and white is in a big trouble here. So the point is that knight to g4 is not very efficient in many cases, because I also have a chance to add my bishop b7 to the attack through c8 square. All right, so instead of doing it, of course, my opponent played the strongest move, knight to g4. He doesn't have to take that pawn on f6. For now, knight g4 is much stronger because white already creates a threat of a maze and fork on f6, just targeting the king, the rook, and the queen, as well as knight h6 in many cases. And since white controls d4 square, for example, I don't have a chance to add my bishop to this a1 h8 diagonal, and this means I don't have really good defense of this f6 pawn. But I played rook to f8 in this situation, being ready to sacrifice the exchange in case white takes on f6. The whole point was, again, in opening the g file. So if knight takes on f6 here, I just take on f6, and after g takes f6, I start attacking the king with the help of my queen. And the fact that the rook on d1 is almost every time is under pressure, under attack, makes the king quite vulnerable, and it basically prevents white's queen from joining the defense. So for example, if king goes to f3 here, I just play queen h5. As you may notice, again, my bishop c5 plays a great role here, limiting the king, controlling dark squares. This prevents the king from running to the queen side. King goes back to the g file. Let's say I continue with this check. King goes to h1, already trying to cover the king with the queen. And here it's important to give the right check. So it is queen to h5, still attacking the rook on d1, which prevents queen h2. This again forces the king to the g file, and everything finishes with the perpetual. Because if here white tries to run away with the help of king f1, it leads to a checkmate. After queen g1, king e2, queen to f2 check, black forces the king to d3. Now, as you may notice, this king is very vulnerable to the check from a6 square. So black can already play bishop a6, but even better is to play queen to f3, in fact. So now if king goes to c4, bishop a6 is a checkmate. So the only defense is bishop e3. Now queen takes, king goes to c4, and bishop a6 finishes the game. So after rook to f8, obviously it's impossible to take on f6. Black most likely creates a threat of taking on g5 already, so it starts looking like black is not really lost at the moment. In fact, white is still winning, so my opponent quickly found the best move. It is queen to e2, very strong, regrouping. Now the queen on h5 is really vulnerable because there is this threat of just knight f6 check, or maybe knight h6 check, winning the queen. And the problem with that, well, if I move the queen away from h5, I no longer have attacking possibilities, so it's definitely lost. I cannot really play king to f7 here, because in that case there is still knight h6 or knight e5 even. And this means I have to make a passive move, king to h8, which is at the same time the move that puts my king on a very vulnerable diagonal. But anyway, I didn't have a better move, so I made this king h8. Still hoping for the tactical trick I prepared. So my opponent played bishop b2 here. It was already possible, by the way, for him to take the pawn on f6 with his own pawn, because, well, he's ready to meet this attack along the g file. There is no really an attack. So rook goes to g8, let's say, just creating this threat of, I don't know, bishop f2 check, or maybe bishop to c8. Doesn't quite work because white has bishop b2. So very strong battery. There is a threat of just f7, in many cases with a checkmate. So let's say if I take on g4, queen takes g4, bishop f2, king takes f2 is even possible, because if queen takes queen, there is f7. And after the only defense, queen to g7, there is f8 queen with a checkmate. So g takes f6 with a winning move here, most likely leading to a decisive advantage. Of course, I'm not forced to play rook to g8, but okay, if I don't play rook g8, if I don't come up with the attack, white gradually improves his position, having 2 extra pawns. Well, it's not in question. White surely wins here, gradually. So, why my opponent didn't play that, I don't know, basically. I still have a feeling that he made a wrong decision after the move 40, in fact. So he didn't make a break, just like I did. And what does it mean? It means that he still had this full information about what happened earlier in the game. And it is a heavy burden, to be honest. So the best thing to do in such a situation is just to reset your brain. And that is what I did exactly. That is why I try to make a break after 40 moves, whatever happens in each and every game. It's very important because you still need, the power. You still need a clear mind. And after 40 moves, you're usually tired, right? And if you don't make this break, well, this may affect your ability to think clearly. And that is what probably happened to my opponent in this game. So he played bishop b2. It is still a good move, no questions. So now there is a threat of, just taking on f6 with the bishop, let's say. Still, there is a possibility of taking on f6 with a pawn at some point, and this may lead to absolutely winning position. So this bishop b2 doesn't spoil the position. I played bishop to c8. My only chance was to create some threats to opponent's king. It's the only target here, and after bishop c8, I exert some pressure on this knight on g4, and I also control indirectly this h3 square, which may basically help me in certain lines. So after bishop c8, it was a critical position. White is really close here to win the game. The first thing to understand is that knight takes f6 doesn't work here. Well, at first glance, it may lead to a checkmate because this battery along a1, h8 diagonal is very powerful, and it does lead to a checkmate, but black checkmates white. So queen goes to h3, and it's over. That was the whole point behind bishop c8, not the only idea behind this move, but one of the main ones. If, for example, g takes on f6 here, well, this is a lost position for black for sure, because white creates a threat of f7. This means I don't have the time for anything active here. Most likely I have to blockade this pawn, otherwise it's just a checkmate or something that leads to amazing material gains for white. So if I play something like rook f7, this means my rook is no longer active, and white can completely prevent my counterplay by playing a simple f4, f5 move. And after that, maybe white doesn't actually finish the game with the help of a checkmate. But it's definitely something that stops my counterplay entirely. White has enormous advantage in space and a lot of different possibilities to penetrate. For example, you may notice that there is a possibility to play queen b5 at some point, creating a threat of queen e8. It's always possible to bring the rook through a1 to a8 square. It's also an interesting idea of just gradually improving the position by playing queen f3, creating the threat of rook to h1. So many different possibilities to win the game here. And what's important here, my bishop on c8 is completely out of play, so there is no chance for me to activate it anymore, and well, there is nothing better than just to resign, I think. Another interesting possibility was to take on f6 with the bishop here. My opponent was probably afraid of the following line, and that was basically my only hope, and well, he recognized this resource of mine and just miscalculated the things. So the point here, I have to take the bishop, obviously, because if king goes to g8, there is knight h6, winning the game instantly. And now after g takes f6, it's the only move since the knight is pinned, I have very interesting check bishop to f2. So that was exactly that tactical trick I mentioned earlier. So after bishop f2, I tried to exploit the bad coordination of white's pieces. So the fact is, the knight is pinned. If knight takes, I just take the queen. The fact is that if queen takes on f2, I take on g4 with the queen, and then the rook on d1 is hanging. And if king takes on f2, I take with the bishop on g4, attacking the queen, attacking the rook which is behind, and also creating a threat of queen h2. And that is what probably stopped my opponent from playing this, but the thing is, white is winning in this position. So there is the power of the pawn on f6 that makes white's position absolutely winning here. So after the correct move, queen to b5, creating a threat of queen b8 checkmate, or maybe queen e8 checkmate at some point if this square is not controlled. Well, this leaves the rook on d1 hanging, but I cannot really take it. That's the whole thing. The only hope for black is to attack the king, so queen h2 is the move here. But after simple king to e3, appears that black simply doesn't have enough resources to cause a problem, and the king simply runs away. So queen g3, king goes to d4, queen f2, my only check here, king goes to c3, now queen goes to e3, king goes to b2. Pay attention how white's queen also takes part in the defense, so controlling some key squares here. And again, my only check here is queen to f2, now king goes to b1, no more checks, which means position is lost. So it's quite a long variation, right? It requires some accurate and good calculation here. And that is what you need, basically, to win the game, usually. So at some point, you have to see the position clearly. That's why, again, I'm stressing that the break after 40 moves is so important. Sometimes it is just vital. Just imagine my opponent had a clear mind at this point. So calculating this line is probably not so simple, but it's not that hard as well. So it's pretty manageable because the things are very forced. So bishop takes f6 was also a winning move. What did my opponent in this position? Well, he played rook to c1 move. At very first glance, it looks very strange, but if you don't see the winning continuation like bishop f6, or it's better to say when you see the bishop f6, but you understand that the problem is that you lose the rook on d1. This rook to c1 starts making sense, right? You just go away with the rook from that vulnerable position, since you think that black doesn't have counterplay anyway. You control the c file now. So whenever my bishop c5, let's say, goes away somewhere, my bishop on c8 will be hanging. So at very first glance, it's just okay. The thing is, well, it basically loses the chance to finish the game right now and gives black great counterplay. So here I came up with my main resource. It is bishop to f2. It works just fine in this situation as well. And here my opponent captured the bishop with the king, although it was still better to take it with another piece. So another moment when my opponent had a chance to get much better position if compared to what happened in the game. And once again, I believe the main reason was that he was tired and probably a bit annoyed by the fact that so winning position like this is basically not that simple. All right. So, two options. Queen takes f2 here, which is possible. In this case, I start the counter-attack using light squares. Now my position becomes not that awful, because we have a very famous pattern, opposite colored bishops in the middle game, and I'm just attacking the king, right, using light squares. Very interesting thing. So king goes to h2. The fact is, on the other hand, is that I don't really have great resources here still. So if I play something like queen h5 here, then king goes to g1. And if I play queen g4, okay, queen g2. So the thing is, white is not really against exchanging queens in this case, and I don't really have a good chance to avoid it in this situation because there is still a threat of just taking on f6, and if my queen loses the connection to the bishop c8, well, it will be hard for me to basically coordinate my pieces to protect everything. So this is one possibility for white to win the game. After king h2 hands, I have to spend the time on king g8 move, which is very annoying, but it's probably the best I can do here. G takes f6 is probably the most ambitious move here, creating a threat of just rook to g1. Now I have queen h3, king goes to g1, king goes to f7, probably my best resource, preparing rook to g8. Now rook c7, bishop goes to d7. I still can make this move because my queen on h3 also takes part in the defense. And after rook takes d7, queen takes d7, and queen to h4, we have the situation in which I have extra exchange, but it doesn't matter, so white is still better because of this great pawns and the possibility to attack my king, the possibility to play e5 at some point, just bring these pawns to great attacking positions, probably even promoting one of them and so forth. But, well, I have to say that this position is no longer lost. It's just a position with the advantage for white. So basically, white spoiled everything by playing rook to c1 already. Another interesting possibility after bishop f2 was actually king to g2 move, which is a very sophisticated way of playing it. Because in this case, I just played bishop takes g4, forcing the queen to take on f2. So it's basically the same pattern, but now I have even the bishop very active. And after queen h3, king to g1, and bishop to f3, at very first glance, I create serious threats. So after queen h2, queen to g4, and king to f2, I had nothing better than to take on e4 here. And now, well, something like queen to g3 still gives white a position with winning chances. I mean, after taking here, f6 is hanging. White has a threat of taking it not only with the bishop but with the pawn as well, creating a sort of f7. The rook is quite active. But okay, to be completely honest, it's no longer that awful. So it's completely manageable task here to make a draw. What happened in the game? My opponent takes the bishop with the king. And this is probably the worst possible capture in this situation, the worst move. Because after bishop takes g4, I have real attacking chances. So now the position is no longer that clear. In fact, well, white's pieces are placed quite badly already. And, well, black even starts getting some winning chances. Can you imagine? It was so lost several moves ago, but, well, staying calm and trying to find the best moves, trying to, you know, just to play on, paid back. So after bishop takes g4, my opponent realized that it's time to take on f6. Otherwise, I just start my attack, right? So I'm ready to come up with these checks. Position remains very complicated. I'm not going to show you all the lines here, all the variations. But you can believe me that, well, this position is no longer lost for black. Bishop takes f6 was played here, and I decided just to capture on f6 immediately. If I play just king g8 here, after, say, queen to e1, queen to h2, and king to e3, this position should be equal, because the king is quite vulnerable now. My king on g8 is no longer that bad. I have some interest in attacking ideas like rook to a8 now. Another idea is just to play queen h3 and so forth. Maybe there is just a perpetual in many lines and so on. But I was already playing for a win here. That's why I captured on f6. So the thing is, after rook to c8 check, I have very interesting move rook back to f8. First, I considered king g7 as well. But g takes f6, king h6, and queen to e3 doesn't lead to clarity. After queen h2, king e1, queen h1, king d2, one more check, king here, queen a1, king here, just bishop takes c8, okay, leads to a position in which I have extra minor piece, but after f5, let's say, my king is very bad. So only white has chances to win the game. That's why I played rook to f8 here. Very interesting defense, by the way, because if rook takes rook, I play king g7, and it is a double attack. So the queen is under pressure on e2 and the rook on f8 as well, and as you may notice, white doesn't have a chance to protect both in one move. So he played queen to b2, intermediate check. After king g8, rook f8, and king f8, he managed to bring the queen to f6. And look at this position. Okay, white still has a lot of pawns, but I'm a minor piece up, right? And if white fails to find a perpetual or something, I will start my attack using the queen and the bishop. So the situation changed dramatically here. And just imagine the psychological background right now. So my opponent was winning at some point, it was clear, but he failed to find the decisive continuation, and now he has to fight for a draw. And add this fact that he didn't make a break, so he was even more tired here. So it was very hard for him. I was quite happy at that point. So I realized that there is no risk of losing for me anymore. I can only win this or make a draw. So the draw was also absolutely acceptable result here, taking into account what happened before. So I was just enjoying the situation. I played king e8 here, and here my opponent had a chance to come up with the perpetual, but he failed to find this. So after queen h8, say king e7, queen f6, king d7, queen g7, king to c8, it feels like the king runs away. In fact, it's not the case here. So queen goes to f8 check, king goes to c7, now queen g7, and I don't have a chance to avoid the perpetual, in fact. So if I play bishop d7, covering the king, there's queen c3 check, and queen always has enough squares to attack my king. Position is very open, all right. So my opponent instead captured the pawn on d6. Well, it was absolutely understandable, because after that, he has everything protected. At first glance, he even still has chances to win the game, taking into account the quantity of pawns and the quality of these pawns. They are all connected. They are not weak at first glance. But that could have been a decisive mistake. So after queen h2 check, king e3, queen to e2 check, I have to mention also that at this point we were both in a new time trouble, sort of. So we still had this increment of 30 seconds for each move, but we have spent almost all the time from this second portion. So as far as I remember, we were both at sort of less than 10 minutes each, and you know, we had to act rather quickly. So now after king d4, I made a very tricky check. So I played queen to f2, and the whole point here is that the king cannot proceed to the center. So if king goes to e5, there is just a checkmate after queen b2, pretty much like in studies. So the best move after queen f2 was king to c4. Basically what I was trying to do here is to add my bishop to the attack. And that's why my opponent probably didn't play king to c4, because this gives me a chance to bring my bishop to the attack with the tempo. And now I control a lot of squares of both colors. Dark squares and light squares are under control, and psychologically it is really hard to make such a decision, especially in a situation when you have to make your decisions quickly. You don't have a chance to calculate everything correctly. So you have to trust your intuition, and in such a situation, of course, the intuition says that, well, you have to avoid light squares with your king. Otherwise, your opponent will have two pieces in the attack instead of only the queen. So this again shows us very interesting thing. Sometimes, at some point, at some stage in the game, it's no longer about what is really going on the board. It's mainly about what you think, what you suppose, what you assume is going on the board. So again, we get back to this psychology thing. All right. So in either case, this king c4 with the best move. So here after this check, king goes to b4. I play queen to d4. It starts looking really dangerous, but after king to a5, I don't really have a checkmate or something. And if I take the pawn at some point, then after queen c6, king f7, queen f6, I cannot really escape checks again. So after queen c6, say king to d8, queen goes to d6, and it's a perpetual. Instead, my opponent played king to c3. I played queen to e3. After king to b2, I played queen to d4. And after king to a3, I captured the pawn. So the situation changed again. So now there is no perpetual or something I have a chance to hide. Because in many cases now, with the king on a3, as you can see, I have additional resource of queen e7. Also, what we can see here is that since my opponent lost the e4 pawn, well, the quality of his pawns diminished seriously. So I blockade f4 and g5, and this d5 is not necessarily that dangerous anymore. So he played king to b2, And here I could have played queen to e7, just, well, protecting everything. And after queen c6, king f7, activating my king. Well, it's still far away from winning the game. It will be still very hard to, convert this advantage. But it's true that this position is with the advantage for black already, and this advantage is convertible. That's the thing. But well, probably I was too optimistic about what was happening on the board, so it was my turn to make a mistake. I played queen e2. That was a stupid idea because without this pawn on e4, there is no really a chance for me to force the king to e5 square anymore. So the king bravely goes towards the center. And as you can see here, this e4 square, additional one, prevents me from making progress. And the fact that the king came closer to the center actually decided the game. I mean, after queen c2, king d4, queen f2, at some point I just came back to the idea of bringing the queen back. But it was very late already, because now he simply exchanges queens. And just compare it to the situation when the king was on a3. In that case, exchanging queens would be, very bad for white, because I would have had a lot of chances to activate my king, to capture the pawn g5, let's say, in a similar situation, and so on. So here, the king is so active on d4, then after exchange of queens, white is in time to create a counterplay. So after king g6, king d6, king f7, king e5, so I tried several possibilities, but nothing worked well for me. So he remains passive here. I mean, he's going back and forth, not giving me a chance to cause the zugzwang. And at some point, I decided just to sacrifice the bishop, but it was not good enough. So after king f5, king d4, king f4, king d3, king g5, white is just in time to reach the drawish zone, and here after king f2, the draw was finally agreed. So what I'm stressing here, showing you this example, is that first of all, just playing on may give you great chances. Not only to survive, not only to make a draw from a worse position. Sometimes you can even win the worst position. So everything depends on the good defense. Another important point here is that a good defense, a correct, efficient defense, is not only about some specific methods and techniques. A great deal of it is based on the right psychological setting. That's why this course is divided onto two parts. In the first part, we're going to discuss the psychology thing. In the second part, we're going to discuss specific methods and techniques. Thank you for your attention, and see you in the course.